Hello, welcome again to Advice to Grad Students, where we are addressing topics that have to do with the grad school experience. I'm your host, Phil Haun. I'm a MIT SSP 2010 graduate. I'm at the U.S. Naval War College. The views expressed here by me do not reflect those of DoD or any other service, and I will extend that same to our guest here today, which is John Minnich, who is a current PhD candidate and a pre-doc fellow at George Washington University. So John, welcome to Advice to Grad Students.
Thank you very much for having me. Great to be here.
Well, it's great to have a current grad student, a senior grad student, and a pre-doc, particularly when it has to do with the topic for today. So can you give me a little bit of insight on, of all the topics that I sent you, why you picked prepping for general exams?
Yeah, well, to start with, I think, I am one of the few and possibly the only student from my own cohort who I think actually enjoyed the general exam preparation process. In fact, I thoroughly enjoyed the entire process, starting with the preparation in mid-June and going all the way through with the exams themselves, the oral exams and so forth. I think people tend to come into the general exam process with the sense that this is a real burden. It's a difficult process. Of course, it is difficult. It's a huge time commitment. It is really difficult. But, I think it's actually can be really fun if you come in with the right mindset. And more importantly, it's actually potentially very useful if you really invest the time and energy into it that it deserves. And I think, the key point there is that the general exams are really the last time in your career as a graduate student and possibly in your career as an academic beyond grad school, where you are really incentivized to read broadly, to think deeply, to try to make connections between seemingly very disparate subjects and topics from different subfields. So in that sense, it can be really useful for just generative theory development, for learning kind of different corners of the discipline that you might not otherwise interact with. And I think a third thing I would say is that one thing I really took away from the generals process is that I think a lot of the very best scholarship in the field is, although it may be somewhat narrow in its kind of immediate empirical focus or whatnot, it's informed by a very deep engagement with big ideas from across the field. And I think that this is where you see, I think of examples like the work of James C. Scott, who's put out these ideas into the field that have sort of percolated through, from his own particular terrain of studying, kind of ordinary everyday forms of resistance in Southeast Asia, that have percolated through other aspects of the field. And now you have people in international relations who are pulling on these ideas to explain how rising powers behave or how other powers, negotiate the balancing process. And so I think that this is something that is really can come from the generals process, again, if you enter it with the right mindset. And so, I see as part of my goal as now a senior graduate student who is going on the market, I want to sort of remind first and second year grad students that this is something you can really learn from, that you should approach it as, a challenge to surmount, but something that is going to be a really fantastic learning experience, rather than something that you just need to get through to proceed on to your own particular research.
All right, well, John, you've done an incredible job of motivating us to get ready for general exams. And so I'm going to push you on the advice. What advice do you give graduate students as they begin to, even as first year students, begin to think about the general exams?
Yeah. So, I would start with one big picture piece of advice, which is kind of just reiterating the point I just made, which is that, it is tempting to view this as a hurdle, as something painful to get through. And I think that especially for students at MIT, we can feel that because a lot of our peer programs don't have quite as substantial or rigorous general examinations processes as us. So, we might look askance at some of our friends in peer programs and think that, well, while we're spending the summer preparing for generals, they're advancing on their research. But the reality is that at this stage in your career, I can almost guarantee you that whatever ideas you're developing now, they will not be your dissertation idea. That developing a really robust dissertation idea, it is a part of engaging with the full breadth of the literature. So, the first thing I would just say is, again, go into it with energy, with excitement. So I have two concrete pieces of advice for first and second year grad students as well. And the first one I would say is something that I wish I had known when I was a first and second year grad student, which is start early on building up a bibliography. Get a reference manager. I use something called BibDesk, which is nice because it integrates easily with LaTeX, which is sort of the word processor of choice for a lot of academics these days. But you can use Zotero. There are any variety of these. And I would say, I made the mistake of not beginning to build up my kind of comprehensive bibliography of just storing references, writing notes on them from the beginning. And what that meant is that when I began the generals process in June after my second year, I basically had to spend a month going through and finding all of these hundreds of references, beginning to build up those notes on them. So if I had done that to begin with, it would have saved me a lot of time and effort. And I think this relates to the second concrete piece of advice I have, which is quickly learn and train yourself on becoming a strategic reader and a strategic note taker. I think this is really important for the generals process because simply put, when you're in grad school, and if you're a first or second year grad student, then you are experiencing this already. You're assigned way too many readings to actually deeply read and engage with everything. And what this means is that you have to learn how to read strategically, to pull out key pieces of information that are going to be useful for you down the road. And of course, I want to just preface this by saying that there are certain readings that you absolutely need to do very deeply. You should engage with very deeply. So I'm not advocating superficial reading, but I think nonetheless, there are specific things that you can do that will really help you down the line in preparing for generals. So for example, one thing I did when I was doing the generals prep is I would adopt a very standardized note-taking procedure for each article, where I would look for a handful of key pieces of information, and each of my notes for a given article would follow more or less the same format. So for any given article, I would start with, I'd read as much of the article I needed to get basically a one-sentence summary of what the article is about, to identify the research question. And then I would have a section that is sort of slightly more detailed comments on the argument itself. For example, if I come across, particularly juicy quotes, really interesting ideas, things that I find potentially problematic that I might want to explore further, and so forth. And then I have a second where you just, briefly jot down what's the overall methodological approach, the research design, what kind of evidence the author bring to bear. Yeah. And then finally have a second section for sort of debates, comments, and things like that. And I think if you can do that, that'll allow you to then very quickly revisit these articles and get a quick sense of what it's about, how can you plug it into your general essay, and so forth.
Okay, speaking of the general essay and the amount of time we have left, let's get into the actual execution, both the written and the oral. What advice do you give to grad students on that, on the writing the essays and the oral after?
Yeah. So, just to kind of summarize what the essay process is. So you'll do 2 written exams, one for each subfield. And on the day of, you'll have, I think it's 8 hours to write 3 essays. Each essay is roughly 7 pages long. And each essay will be on a given topic. The key thing here is basically by the time you get to the day where you're writing the essay, you want to have sort of imbibed everything and then taken, a couple of days break to let it sort of gestate and kind of percolate in your mind, so that when you actually get to the writing process, in a way, it's just kind of flowing out of you, And I know that seems sort of hard to believe at this point, but trust me, by the time you've spent an entire summer reading and, practicing. And of course, I think another thing I would suggest is at least once or twice in the preparation process, try to sit down and do a timed written exam on your own, and then read over your essay and see, if you are able to write a fully formed, well-structured essay in the time limit, 30 to 45 minutes of, note-taking, and then maybe an hour or 2 of the actual writing, then I think that's really, really good preparation.
Okay, and finally, the dreaded oral exams. What advice do you give going into the orals?
Yeah, well, I would say It's a little bit hard to say because my sense is that there is a lot of variation across subfield. And of course, a lot depends on who is on your particular generals committee. So, from my own experience, I did examinations in international relations and comparative politics. And, so my committee was, we had one comparativist and then Taylor Fravel, my advisor, as the sort of representative of international security. And then we had an international political economy scholar. In my case, it was actually a really pleasant and engaging conversation. I mean, we went in, and of course, they will press you on your questions. And sort of the idea, the expectation is that, they'll pick a point that you make in one of your articles, and they'll ask you a question about it. You'll give an answer, they'll ask you a follow-up question. And the goal is to kind of push you to the limits of your knowledge, to see where those limits reside, and also, to some extent, how you creatively respond extemporaneously on the spot. The thing I would say is, go into it having read over your written work, thought about, identified potential problems or issues or things you wish you had mentioned, things you wish you discussed, jot those down, but go in not on the defensive. This is treated as sort of a dialogue with people who fundamentally really care about your intellectual development and want to see you thrive.
Oh, well, fantastic. I agree with you on that. I remember one of my 3 essays, I totally boofed. And I spent a week thinking about it. And I came into the oral saying, if I were to rewrite this essay, this is exactly how I would rewrite it. And I took the air right out of the room. So anyway, great advice today, John, on preparing for general exams. And all those of you who are watching, I know you're going to do a great job. All right. Thanks a lot, John, again.
Thank you so much.
Advice for MIT SSP grad students.